All right, we're going to begin. Welcome, I'm Terry Martin. I'm the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and welcome to our symposium on the impact of 4 years of warfare on Ukraine. Every year, the HERE has a Jacyk Fellow, a distinguished senior scholar. This year, the Jacyk Fellow is Andrea Graziosi, well-known historian of the Soviet Union and known to Ukrainianists for his work on the first 15 years of Soviet Ukraine and the peasant-urban conflict, amongst many other things. When we chose Andrea to be the Jacyk Fellow, he's an old friend of mine, and I knew him as a great organizer who organized many conferences that I went to in my early scholarly years in Paris, which was a delight for anyone. So I asked Andrea if there was anything that he wanted to do. And being a historian, he said he'd like to study he'd like to explore the impact of the war on Ukraine. And I said, let's do it. We put together logically a panel of organizing committee of 4 historians, me, Andrea, Mark Kramer, and Sergei Flochy, put together a list of topics, invited people happily. They said yes, thank you to all the participants. And we expect to learn a lot. So with that, I will turn over to Andrea.
Yes. So first of all, thank you. Thank you to the Harvard Ukrainian Institute for inviting me for this term. It was a great pleasure. And the story, Terry already said the story about this seminar, because already last year, at the end of last year, 1 year ago, that is when I was here 1 year ago, it was clear that this war was a major war. It was no more a short event. It was a major war that was going to change many things in Ukraine, in Russia, but also in the European Union, in the European countries, in the future of Europe. So ideally, I would say we should have there should be a workshop on the changes that this war will bring to European countries and to the future of Europe in many ways. And it also, to me, was evident, and is evident, this war is going to have an impact, as I was saying, a huge impact on the definition of us in what was once the West, in a way. Because as you know, the West was, the first modern definition was by Auguste Comte, the founder of positivism, who said that Europe was not good at work because it took in Russia and excluded America. This is in the mid-19th century, 19th century. And now we have a war that is redefining also what the West and the Atlantic community is, and establishing new borders for Europe and new perspectives. So it's a huge event, and I think it's very important to discuss. And of course, as Paul writes in his very interesting papers, we will not know about the changes until the war is over, in a way. But many are already there and can be seen and discussed. And of course, I would say, and I will finish in a few minutes, but this, to see now the changes that the war has brought to Ukraine, for example, is very important for the capacity of Ukraine to read positively how the war will end. Because the war may end in many ways, more favorable, less favorable, at least to me, to my opinion, that is. But still, the most important, one of the most important things is also how the war will be read and interpreted in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine. And to see the changes that had already produced, among which is clearly the birth of a new Ukrainian state, and a new Ukrainian awareness and identity, as he writes in his, it's a very major fact that already happened. And the breaking with Russia that was not there has already happened. And the shifting of economic relationship and the shifting of the military and very negative demographic and relatively positive religious and linguistic phenomenon occurred already. So we have the elements to discuss this change and to start understanding them and to provide I hope, this is my hope at least, and with this, provide the Ukrainian political leadership and society at large with elements in order then to read positively this war, as much as there can be a positive things in a war. What is striking to me, and these things nobody can take out of Ukraine, this I say in general now also, because this war changed so much also, my opinion and my views of things, that the resistance has been a choice, a state has been built, a new legitimizing discourse has begun based on this war. The former one was based, we remember, on the Soviet experience, on the Holodomor. Now it's a new major event for the history of the country. And above all, Ukraine now exists and has friends. This was not the case in previous crises. Ukraine had very little friends in 1918, 1919. Think only about Poland, for example, the new Poland that was being born. So I think, although I take Paul, I quote Paul because he sent me longer papers that I read because I have to discuss. It's true that we will be able to fully understand these changes once the war is over. There are already many things that we can see clearly, and that can help us understand also how to, let's say, begin to construct an interpretation of this that is not unfavorable. And I think there are the elements for this. So I thank everybody for being here. Everybody we invited accepted the invitation. This is a more, let's say, professional discussion than a public event, though we wanted to keep it public. That is, we invited specialists that are talking to other specialists. But I trust this will be very interesting, and I thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you. So I think Paul can start.
Are you ready? Yeah.
Yes, 20 minutes. Well, we can. We finished very early because they put so much pressure, the timing. But so you can take 3 minutes more and do 23, 24 minutes. Because you sent me a very long paper, so I liked it. So.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I'm very grateful to Huri. I spent a semester here, I think 8 or 9 years ago now, and had the time I needed to write a book about Russia's relationship with Ukraine. And so it's really nice to be back. Andrea mentioned a new Ukrainian state, and that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about. I'm a political science. I'm not an historian, but I want to be an historian now to say I might be able to tell you something about the past, but I surely cannot predict the future when it comes to Ukraine. So I'm going to raise more questions than I am going to tell you verifiable truths, but nonetheless. This idea of a new Ukrainian state, I think this is right. It's true. It's almost certainly going to be true territorially, but also in terms of population. And Andrea mentioned the legitimizing discourse, the understanding of what Ukraine is and where the legitimacy of its government comes from. This is changing as a result of this war. And ironically, of course, Putin has managed to produce the exact thing he started out denying. Right, which is a clearly Ukrainian state that is clearly distinct from Russia. And I should just say, this is an aside, but I think it actually has raised the stakes in this war for Russia. Because if Russia does not completely annihilate Ukraine, it is absolutely going to have the Ukraine that it said never existed. Looming over the remarks I want to make is this famous line from Charles Tilly about the formation of states in early modern Europe. War made the state, and the state made war. And if I had a dollar for every time I've heard that quoted since this war started, I have a lot of dollars. But I actually think it's very appropriate. And so it's one of the things I want to think about is how war is remaking the Ukrainian state and politics, and how that state is making war. So I unwisely gave Andrea 10 points that I wanted to make, which, do the division. I'll talk fast, and I may skip one or two. But I want to talk about elections to begin with, because elections, in the common conception and among political scientists, are the mainspring of democratic politics. And yet, because of this war, Ukraine has not been able to hold them, and probably won't be able to hold them until the war is over. And I want to be clear, I think people who point that out as a criticism generally are doing so with a political point in mind and a political agenda. That's not the point I'm making. What I am saying is that this has submerged politics in a way. When we think about democratic politics, we focus a lot on elections and the positioning with the anticipation of elections. And we don't have that in Ukraine right now, or we don't have it as much because we don't know when the next elections will be. And so we don't know who the candidates will be, although things are starting to shape up a little bit. And so it seems like politics has gone away a little bit. The other thing that we look at often is legislation. What's going on in the parliament? What bills are being passed? Who's lining up against whom, and so on. And that also has been largely submerged from public view. And so there's this sense, I think, that politics, that there's been rallying around the flag. Ukraine is unified. Politics has been submerged. And I think it's been submerged from view, but I think it is very much still there. I think the contest for power and influence in Kyiv remains intense, even if it's a little bit more behind the scenes. And I think there is already a lot of positioning and maneuvering for what will happen when politics becomes more publicly contestable after the conflict. And frankly, in particular, when there's a big reconstruction agenda that people are going to want to have control of. How are elections likely to shape up? So now I am going to get a little bit into the prediction business. There's a couple things I want to point out. One is this is going to be a very different polity with a very different electorate. The borders are likely to be different than they were in 2019 or in 2014. And the electorate, which in some respects, right, is constrained by the borders. We know this. When Russia took over a chunk of eastern Ukraine and Crimea in 2014, they took many of the most pro-Russian voters out of the Ukrainian electorate. And you could see the results of that in subsequent elections. So I think a huge question is what the electorate looks like in post-war Ukraine. And I can raise some questions about it, but I can't tell you all of the answers. A couple of things that I would focus on. The obvious one is what territory is in and out of Ukraine, and of the people who lived in that territory before the war, which of them end up in post-war Ukraine? I think a super interesting question for the political scientists, if they can figure out the methods to do it, is whether people from, say, Donetsk Oblast who end up in Western Ukraine after the war, do they vote like they did when they lived in Donetsk before the war? Do they vote more like people in Ivano-Frankivsk vote or wherever they live after the war, or something different? It'll be a really good experiment about like what shapes voting behavior in a place that has tended to have regionalized voting. But the other big one is migration. That's going to hugely affect the electorate. And I'll just raise one question, which is of the people who've migrated out of Ukraine during the war, we have no idea how many are going to come back. And I think there's a panel this afternoon on demographics. And so I'm just going to raise this one point, which is I am speculating that if a lot of people don't come back but continue to vote, you'll have this very different kind of politics where a huge part of elections and election campaigning is reaching out to a diaspora population. And I think of Turkey as an example for this, where there's this enormous Turkish diaspora in Western Europe, but particularly in Germany, that is a major player in Turkish elections. And I think we're likely to see that in post-war Ukraine. Another thing I want to raise that's related to elections and democracy is presidentialism, the nature of this political system. This is becoming a very heavily presidentialized system. It's always, constitutionally, I should say, constitutionally, they have this thing we call a bicephalous executive. There's a president and a prime minister. But with the last several elections before the war, we saw the president become dominant. This was true when Yanukovych was able to get his people installed in the leadership of the parliament in 2010. And then the same thing with Zelensky in 2019. The power of the president then to shape the timing of elections for the parliament has allowed the president to dominate the parliament more in the past. Obviously, this war as well has consolidated power in the executive branch. And so how that's going to shake out after the elections, I think is going to have a massive impact on Ukrainian politics. and probably raise the stakes of presidential elections. We don't know. Pivoting to the immediate question of the war. I don't know how this war is going to turn out. What I have been following is public opinion about the war. And I would just say two things. And I would say this also anecdotally, having talked to a lot of people in Kiev in the coldest part of late January, early February when I was there. It didn't matter how cold it was and how often the power was going out. It's just the resilience, the determination not to cave in is pretty steady overall. That said, there's been a very slowly, going all the way back to 2022, a very gradual decrease in the number of people saying we should continue to fight no matter what, and a slow, steady upticking of the people saying territorial concessions may be worthwhile if it ends the war. I don't think we can project any tipping anytime soon. In fact, I think that's more likely to flatten out. But what I think is then interesting to follow is for somebody like Zelensky, at some point trying to negotiate a peace deal, I think he is going to be much more limited by public opinion than we anticipate. He, at least for the time being, still seems to want to run for re-election, but even apart from running for re-election, he can't go too far without domestic spoilers in one way or another potentially scuttling an agreement. And as certain Western actors put a lot of pressure on Ukraine to make concessions, I think they probably should be more cognizant that there's actually only so much Zelensky can deliver because the country is a democracy. After the war, whatever the settlement is, unless something really great happens and Ukraine recovers its 1991 to 2014 borders, which doesn't seem terrifically likely at this point, there's going to be a blame game. This is already going on. Blame for the level of readiness in 2022, and blame for various things about the war has been fought. And I don't know how that's going to shake out, but I think it will be one of the major elements of the first post-war elections. Relating to that is then the question of identity. And there are people here, and will be people here later, who've studied Ukrainian national identity a lot more closely than I have. But there is this question of how 10 plus years of war has shaped Ukrainian identity. We've seen some things already that we can verify. I would go so far as to basically discuss or talk about the collapse of pro-Russian Ukraine. I think the folks who really thought Ukraine should be closely aligned with Russia are either moved to Russia or are going to be in parts of Ukraine that the Ukrainian government no longer controls, or many of them have actually been converted. Or if they were ambiguous, they're like, no, those folks who attacked us, that's not such a good idea. So one of the most important cleavages in pre-war Ukraine is gone, essentially, the regional cleavage. And it was more regional than it was ethno-national or linguistic in my view. It was regional. And I think it's largely gone. What's going to happen with language and language policy? There's been a lot of linguistic re-identification, a lot of Russian speakers learning to speak Ukrainian, or people who speak both languages choosing to speak more in Ukrainian. Hard to say how that's going to shake out in the long term, but also then how it's going to influence politics in voting. Does that become an important cleavage? I don't know. And what will happen with memory politics? Memory politics was very controversial in the 2014 to 2019 period. The so-called decommunization laws were highly controversial. I don't know what's going to happen with that either. I only suspect that dealing with those issues is going to be a big issue again after the war. I think there will probably be a new initiative to nail down some of those positions even more starkly than before, less desire for compromise, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Andrea asked me to speak about ideology, and I had to think about this pretty hard because you talked about a legitimizing discourse. Ideology has not been a major factor in Ukrainian politics, at least ideology as I think about it, like traditional left-right cleavage, or liberal economics versus state-controlled economics. The main cleavage in Ukrainian politics post-1991 has been this regional one. And I think that's now going away. So in the absence of ideological cleavages, or I would say in the absence of any of the old cleavages, what are going to be the new political cleavages in Ukraine? What are the fights going to be about? In 2019, there were not huge ideological differences between, say, Poroshenko and Zelensky, and they tried very hard to make more of them than there were. The claims were basically, I'm more competent than the other person, and I'm less corrupt. And those are the things people have largely voted on, other than region. Poroshenko tried to play the nationalist card in 2019, and it didn't work for him. So what are the cleavages likely to emerge after the war? What are elections likely to be about if it's not just a question of who's going to control access to government, and so on? Will it be left-right? Will it be populists versus institutionalists that we've seen in so much of the rest of Europe and in this country as well? Nationalists versus internationalists? Will it be about relations with the European Union? I do not know. So that's my question. If the East-West divide becomes less salient, or if regional politics become less salient, what's going to structure parties? What's going to structure elections? Maybe this part will show some continuity, which is Ukrainian political parties have largely been individual parties. Poroshenko has a party. Tymoshenko has a party. Zelensky has a party. I suspect that will continue because I don't see emerging new profound ideological cleavages which are going to replace the personalist parties. One of the important things that emerged prior to the war, but the importance of which has been, I think, demonstrated by the war, is decentralization and local government. How has decentralization shaped the war, and vice versa? I don't want to overgeneralize. Especially in the early weeks and months of the war, local governments that had gained new capacity since 2014, 2015, really took on a lot of tasks that the central government just couldn't focus on. They dealt with refugees. They, in some cases, put armed units in the field and so on. And so we've seen this buildup of local government capacity and of people's, I think, belief in the importance of local government and local self-control. And so what from 1991 to 2014 was a very unitary state. And there was always resistance for various reasons to delegating power out to regions or localities. I'm not sure that is going to get put back in a bottle afterwards. What are the prospects for post-war Ukraine? Well, I think there's going to be a big battle between local governments and the central government, and also between different factions at both levels for battles over the resources and the decision-making for reconstruction. I'm not sure as much money is going to materialize from outside Ukraine as people are hoping for, but regardless of that, there's a lot of money is going to be spent and a lot of decisions are going to be made in reconstruction, and everybody's going to want to be the ones that control it. And I think that's one area we'll see of competition between local and central authorities. And I might just say that to the extent that external actors like the European Union contribute funds, they're going to have a big impact in sort of determining whether that goes through local channels or through central ones. A big part of that fight, of course, over controlling reconstruction aid will be because there's a certain opportunity for graft, right? And I'm always hesitant to talk about corruption in the context of Ukraine because it has been used as such a propaganda argument against Ukraine. Oftentimes, people who are talking about corruption in Ukraine are using it as a reason to discredit Ukraine as a whole and undermine the argument for Western support for Ukraine. And I want to be absolutely clear, I reject that position. At the same time, we can't pretend that it's not there. And I think it's important for two reasons. One is, it matters to Ukrainian citizens. Even in the middle of the war, if you read polling data on what matters to Ukrainians, what are their major concerns? The war is number one, but corruption is still right up there with it. And so in terms of conversations, election campaigns, and so on about post-war Ukraine, corruption is going to be on the agenda whether anybody likes it or not. And the other one is that it does matter to external actors. It's always it has been an excuse for not helping Ukraine. And that has been, therefore, a national security liability for Ukraine. Whether that's a fair thing or not, we can argue about. So on the one hand, the sense that Ukraine is tackling corruption will be very important in terms of how much aid does come in after the war. And the flip side of that is, I think there's a lot of hope, and I certainly hope, that some of the external actors that have been the most adamant and have pulled the most powerful levers in terms of fighting corruption in Ukraine in the past will play that role in the future. In several occasions that we can think of going back over the last couple of decades, really, important milestones in anti-corruption fighting were decisively kept on track or put on track by threats from external actors to withdraw key funding. The IMF, in several cases, has kept things on track, and more recently, the outcry over the neutering of Nabu and Sapo has been really powerful. The fact that those things had to happen, unfortunately, is a sign of, even in the middle of war, how much corruption still there is. And I will just say, this is not a Ukrainian thing. There's a lot of corruption in a lot of countries around the world, and I think when we single out Ukraine, we're being blind. But more to the point, every war in history has fostered that sort of thing, because contracts are being given very quickly. Look at the United States during the Civil War, or even during World War II. So we shouldn't exaggerate the situation, but at the same time, I do think it's going to be an important factor in what happens in post-war Ukraine. Related to that, economics. This, I think, is really tricky. I think there's, if we go back to, say, 2023, when a lot of optimists thought that the war might end in 2023 or 2024, there was this idea that there was going to be this post-war boom. The European Union was lined up to commit a lot of money. There was a lot of support. There was, I think, a lot of consensus within Ukraine, and there was this idea that we'll get this war over, and there's going to be this boom in Ukraine. I think we're going to have to see. I'm a little bit worried that the longer the war drags on, a lot of other things are happening too. One of which is the fiscal position of many of the European states is deteriorating. The war in Iran has not helped with that at all, and so whatever the great intentions were in 2022, 2023, I worry that in 2027, 2028, 2029, whenever this war is over, that when it comes around to actually passing budgets in the European Union, there's not as much money as folks are hoping for. As in every democratic country around the world, the state of the economy will be enormously important in politics. And so we'll have to see how that goes. Pivoting from the future to the past or to the present, the war, of course, has devastated Ukraine's economy. The damage it's done to farmland that's been mined or poisoned or simply taken over by Russia, factories that have been blown up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The damage it's done to human capital, which is one of Ukraine's biggest strengths. I don't know how to measure it, but it's significant. There are some opportunities as well. Ukraine, all of a sudden, as we all know, has become a leader in certain sectors of modern warfare. And that's an area in which I think potentially there's a lot of growth possible. We'll have to see how that goes. Ukraine struggled mightily after the end of the Cold War to turn its massive military industrial complex into something it could sell in the world. There was not a big market for SS-24 missiles, unfortunately, or Antonov aircraft. But there's a big market right now in certain places for anti-drone equipment and techniques and tactics. Whether that can be developed into a profitable economic sector, we're going to have to see. Lastly, looking at the clock, security. Back to war making the state and the state making war. This war is not going to end this war. That is to say, at some point, I hope that the active hostilities are going to cease, but Russia's not going anywhere. And Russia's ambitions over Ukraine are not going to go anywhere unless Russia actually completely defeats Ukraine. And so the tasks of protecting Ukraine from the next Russian invasion are going to be massive. Again, a lot will depend on what external actors decide to do, but I think the Ukrainians have come to realize that as much as possible, they're going to have to rely on their own means. And that means both economically paying for weapons, but also building the weapons, maintaining a much larger army than it had before 2022, and so on. And so I think there's a possibility, or a way to think about this is what happens when Ukraine becomes a national security state. And in a way, it's going to have to become a national security state in the sense that it is constantly preparing and staying at a fairly high level of readiness for war. What does that do to the economy? What does that do to politics, right? What does it do to politics, for example, when you say we have to have a very high level of surveillance over everybody and everything in order to prevent penetration by Russian agents and spies and so on? What does it happen in politics if you have some fairly, let's say, liberal rules about who can be arrested on the grounds that they might be a Russian agent? And how do politicians maybe start to use those things to their advantage? I think those are huge questions. We just don't know. Civil-military relations is part of that, but only one part of that. The military was never a big actor in Ukrainian politics prior to 2014, or really even 2019. I think the military is going to be a big actor in Ukrainian politics going forward, as shown by the fact that the two most popular candidates after Zelensky for the possible presidency are the former General Zaluzhny and the general and now head of the presidential staff. I don't know how that's going to shake out, but it's a big, big issue and how civil-military relations shakes out. What happens when, for example, if you get in a situation where no politician of any party really feels like they can deny a military request for more funding, for more weaponry, for more preparedness? That's a very different sort of country than what Ukraine has had before. So that's a lot of questions. The last big question I'm going to raise is about the relationship with the European Union. The European Union has always been the hoped-for deus ex machina in Ukrainian politics and economy, right? The Europeans are going to help us stop corruption. The Europeans are going to bring in lots of money for investment, and trade with the Europeans is going to help our economy boom. Some of that, all of that is still possible in one way or another. What that means, though, is that the relationship with the European Union becomes crucial. That depends in part on Ukraine being able to convince the Europeans that it continues to be a reliable partner. It also depends a lot on politics in Europe that are beyond Ukraine's control. We saw something very positive from Ukraine's perspective happen last weekend, but of course there's a long way to go in various elections around the European Union. So just to try to wrap up in some way, in lieu of conclusions, since all I've done is raise questions, I think Ukrainian politics and the Ukrainian polity has been transformed by this war and will be transformed again, or will continue to be transformed after this war ends. And so for people like me who maybe thought we knew something about Ukrainian politics, even if we did and we weren't wrong, we're going to have to learn a whole bunch of new stuff, because I think a lot of what we thought is going to be different in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. As you see, it was a very rich outline, and actually I got a much richer paper, so I have a few minutes just to ask questions to Paul for the debate, but also for home, maybe when he's back home. The first thing, that, of course, is very good argument. There are no elections, so it's very difficult to understand politics. There is no legislative activity, so it's very difficult to understand politics, alliances, interests, because the war covers everything. This is very true. At the same time, it's very true what you say, that already one can see clearly, even when you speak with friends, but not only when you speak with friends, that there are national, let's say, leaders emerging with ambitions to preside over this new state. And my first question is, given, and of course there is Zelensky that wants, there is Zaluzhny, there is Poroshenko, there are options. And as you noticed before, the Ukrainian politics was based on, you say, regionalism. I actually prefer using cities, because I think Ukraine is a cities place more than a region place. There is Odessa, there is Kharkiv, there is the Donbas cities, there is Kiev, there is Rio, there are many. It's much more like Italy or Germany than it is like France or Russia, in my view. It's not so much a question of regions, but it's a question of cities that are heads of regions. So in a way, it's a strange place. That place I like the more because it's like my own in a way. So, and you also make the good point that in the past, after 91, politics was not so much based on ideology in the way, in the sense we described it in the West, although there were a lot of ideological elements about the Soviet past. Think of the Holodomor, think of the OUN, the resistance in Western Ukraine. It's not that it was missing, but was more about the history of the country than it was about ideology for the future. So my question is, do you see that is some form of ideology coagulating around these possible candidates? Are they building ideological discourses? Are they building visions about, because ideology, after all, is also vision about the future of the country? Can we see already elements in which this, let's say, Zelensky is different from Zelensky or from Poroshenko in a more elaborated form than the one can imagine? This is my first. I think it's a very interesting question, and because again, when you speak with friends and you ask, and they say, no, they are different, but then they do not elaborate very often. So if you can elaborate, it would be very grateful. The second thing is that clearly a state has been built. By the way, it would be very interesting to write the history of how this has been built after, especially 2014, because I presume that Yanukovych tried to destroy the little that had been built before, systematically, because he wanted to hand it over to Russia. So he wanted a regional administration. He didn't want a state. So a state has been built after 2014, a history that is, and now we have this state, and you say, what are the characteristics? You say the end of regionalism, maybe a new one, a new, since ideology seems not to be a great issue, a new, you mentioned this at a certain point, a new relationship between center and peripheries, the role of the presidential administration, and also the role of this great autonomy that localities have conquered in Ukraine. So what are the main characteristics of the new state that emerged, that was built, besides having a military and efficient railway system, because this is true, otherwise they wouldn't be able to fight. So evidently it's also an efficient state, because it's able to fight, has been able to fight a war against Russia for 4 years. So there must be also some element of a technostructure that has been built that is able to run. Mm-hmm. And this is not something easy or something banal to in a country. The other, third question is about, you rightly said, the influence of Russia is going to diminish, has already diminished a lot. People that were friendly to Russia or close to Russia, even if they were not friendly, are now under the Russian administration, and some other went over, emigrated, and some distanced themselves from Russia. But this is a huge break, because after all, the history of Russia and Ukraine had been so much intertwined over the past 200 years, let's say. So what are the consequences of this? And what you're very right, this is very obvious. Putin obtained the contrary of what he wanted. I think Putin is, I hope so. Of course, hopes now are substituting for rational analysis maybe, but I think Putin has been a big loser of this war from many points of view already, in spite of him possibly winning militarily something. But what is this break? What does it break with Russia means for Ukrainian history? Mm-hmm. Because this is a huge question, because the countries. And then I like very much, and then I will finish with the European Union, but I will not mention identity. I like very much the question you ask about the role, so maybe you can say something else, or I think it would be worth it anyway to think about something more about this. The role of these new groups that are emerging, displaced people. You mentioned internally, but also internally, not only externally. You mentioned Turkey, but think of Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
Orban was able to win election because he had the support of all the, let's say, Hungarian citizens in Transylvania, in Serbia, even in Ukraine.
Yep.
So this is very true. This is going to have a big impact, this group. And the other thing I like very much, but it demands even more, especially being Italian, I think about the World War I and the impact. What about the split between combatant and not combatant? Yeah. Because this is going to be huge, however the war is going to end. And it will be important, because if it's clearly a win, it's something, but clearly it's not going to be maybe a clear or whatever. There are elements, you're losing some territory. So millions of people have fought, millions refused to fight or didn't go. Then there were millions who helped the ones that were fighting with civil, this is very important. But these are clearly different groups with different ideas and different experience in a crucial fight. So this, I think, is a very good idea, that this, the role of, think of Europe after World War I. Yeah. It's the role of this, in Italy was ex-combattenti, former combatant.
My grandfather.
Yeah, it's a huge impact. The last one is about Europe, and I say this because being in Italy, I, of course, think about it a lot. Clearly, this war is having an impact on European countries. I think European Union, the name is a tricky one. It's an association of states. It's not a union. But clearly, the war is making, one can see the possible emerging of something different from an association.
Mm-hmm.
And how NATO is going to be used, what remains of NATO, to build a European NATO. This is very much discussed in Europe now. If this is successful, of course, Ukraine can enter this with a huge role, because it has the best army in Europe, possibly, now. So if this idea that there is in Europe that we have to use the NATO equipment, the NATO bases, the NATO structure to build it. And the other thing is clearly, and I finish with this, up to now, Europe has been, central, something that attracted, starting with Brexit, started to lose parts. And now, clearly, within Europe is emerging a bloc that is made of Scandinavia, the Baltic countries, Germany, Poland, Denmark, that has not the same interest than Spain or Portugal or even Italy in a way. Italy is a complicated country. So this, the merging of a new Europe is very much tied to Ukraine. It's not just that Europe is going to influence, the reverse is true. I think this is something one has to keep in mind. So again, thank you so much for these are big questions, but I thought it was very interesting to raise them, and I thank you for doing it.
Thank you.